So welcome everyone to the Future Teacher webinar series, and we're going to kick off by actually announcing the fact that we have won a Jisc Community Champion Advocate Award. And over to Rosemary to explain the reason why we've won the award.
Yeah, so folks, those of you who've been in this community possibly since its inception will know that Lillian, Ron and Alistair were our founding members of the community nearly 10 years ago, and they have given so much to Future Teacher. It started with a little bit of funding, but now is run purely on a voluntary basis, and it does take a lot of work to pull this together, to get the fantastic speakers that we've got to support everyone. So whilst we've got a slightly wider organising team, Lily and Alistair and Ron carried the community for a very long time. So we're hugely, hugely grateful, and we wanted just to recognise, just how much they've given to the whole sector and how much they champion not just digital technologies, but inclusive practices. And it's really topical that we're talking about that today, but it's a theme that runs throughout the whole of the Future Teacher community. So we're just delighted to see all of their work recognised and hugely grateful for everything that you've done, folks. So I think I'll hand back to you, Lillian.
Thank you so much for that. We're really pleased and really grateful for that recognition as well, and for this community. Rosemary says we've carried, but actually I think we've been buoyed up by this community. So yeah, thank you everyone, and to all our speakers who have made this possible. But without further ado, I'm going to ask if Simon, you're willing to screen share and introduce yourself. Yeah, Alistair will do the bell ringing.
Right. I will assume my screen has successfully shared. Otherwise, I'll hear lots of shouting. Wonderful. Hi, everybody. Well, I've got an intro slide in a moment, so I'll introduce myself in just a moment. But just to say that the talk I'm giving today is an accessible publishing health check. So we're going to look at publisher progress on accessibility and hard problems, and that will all be revealed in a moment. Just to introduce myself, so I'm Simon Mellins. I'm a digital publishing consultant. I've had over 17 years of experience in digital publishing. I think it might have crossed into 18 now. Specialised in accessibility since about 2017. And I've worked across all different publishing sectors at this point with clients of all different sizes from all around the world. As a consultant. I'm a co-founder of the Publishing Accessibility Action Group, PAAG. That is a very useful free resource for accessibility information. Leader of a course with the Independent Publishers Guild on accessible publishing. A Book Machine editorial board member, and I host the Digital Publishing Podcast, which often talks about these topics. But I'm not a lawyer. Very important to say this. I'm not a lawyer. We're going to talk about legislation today. We cannot avoid talking about that when we talk about accessibility, but it's very important that we are very clear. This isn't legal advice, and not only is my advice not legal advice, you should seek real legal advice if there's any kind of confusion about how to interpret or follow legislation. Compliance is a legal topic, so we talk about it here only to the extent that we can. So with that in mind, we'll just briefly talk about the current legislative position. This is a dynamic part of this, but at the moment, here's where we're at. So in the EU, the European Accessibility Act has been enforced since June the 28th, 2025, or at least enforceable. We're yet to have any legal cases actually brought affecting the publishing industry. There's only been one that's to do with retail. So the directive, the way that things work with the EU, if anyone's not used to it, is there's a directive from the EU, and then individual member states have to create laws that reflect the directive. Now, in the case of the European Accessibility Act, several of the European countries simply transposed the directive exactly as it was, with all of its ambiguities intact. Some wrote their own legislation to try and reflect what was in there. And that has meant that because of those two different approaches, we've got some variation across member states, mainly around a backlist, mainly around kind of catalogue publishing. We'll talk a bit about that later on. The big headline at the moment is in the USA. There are changes coming up in April to the Americans with Disability Act, Title II. To everyone's surprise, it's still happening despite the current administration. Now, these changes principally are to bring in the same standard as the EAA, which is WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA. But in the case of the ADA, this includes journals as well. This law prohibits state, local government, and federally linked entities, which is pretty broad, from procuring or distributing inaccessible materials. So you can see, whereas with the EAA, this is a kind of consumer rights piece. In the USA, this is incumbent upon those distributing. So the publishers are not the ones being legislated here, but it has the same effect, because if publishers want their publications to be of any interest to any of these bodies, then they need to be accessible. Both of these pieces of legislation have undue burden carve-outs, but they work in different ways. And the bar for claiming that in the ADA is higher. It's more difficult. I don't have time to go into all of the details of this stuff today, but it is slightly different. In the UK, of course, we've got existing legislation that doesn't directly address publishing, but can be applied by precedent or by case law at any time. So, of course, the 2010 Equality Act, which gives us this term reasonable adjustments that those of us in the UK are usually very used to seeing. And, of course, PSBAR, the public sector's body's accessibility regulations, which brings in most universities and libraries, meaning digital content they distribute needs to meet the same standard. So you'll notice that WCAG is the theme running through here. The only real variation is about backlist publishing. When it comes to new publishing, the legislation is fairly similar across the board. So how are publishers doing? And it's important to say this comes from my vantage point as a consultant. And although that gives me a pretty broad perspective, it's nowhere near universal. So everyone will have a different sense of this depending on who they've spoken to. But broadly speaking, the publishers are a mixed picture, with some very far down the road, some really impressive work that's been done, but many others who are barely reacting as if nothing has happened. Some had almost no response to the European Accessibility Act. Ultimately, this is likely to become more pressing as libraries, schools, and retailers all around the world start to insist on these requirements. I think that's what's going to drive a lot of change here, and that will be anyone that wants to advocate for this, pressuring publishers and saying, we can't cure your publications until they meet the standard. That's going to be enormously impactful instead of waiting for lawsuits to land. School and university procurement requirements are likely to be a major demand driver for publishers wishing to sell them going forward. Educational publishing faces some unique challenges just because the content tends to be relatively complex, and there are additional regulatory and procurement requirements affecting it. I won't go into all the different sectors of publishing because a lot of them are not relevant here, but here's just to say that it is more of an acute problem for education and for academia because of these procurement rules, whereas in trade, things are a bit slower. So we're going to look at hard problems, and there are 6 here that I'm going to whiz through. Yes, 5 would have been neater, but I had to choose accuracy over prosody, so 6 it is. We'll start with image description, and this is something that we are constantly talking about in accessible publishing, and it's really the thing that we all want publishers to get a handle on because it's so woefully lacking out there in the books that are out there. So a lot of people here will know this. All content images need to be described, but decorative images must not be, or indeed where that description would be redundant because there's content nearby explaining it, or the caption is descriptive. There's a lot of nuance to all of that, but that's the thing that publishers are struggling to really understand properly. Another big point is context being vital to quality. So the way an image is described is very different depending on the context in which it appears. And that makes working in bulk kind of difficult when they just have a pile of images that someone sent to run through. Of course, we've got to tailor to reader expectations and capabilities. Language level's a big part of that. There are AI solutions constantly popping up on the market every 5 minutes, it seems, to try and help with image description. The quality of those varies widely, and there are a few good ones. There's an awful lot of rubbish. So how are publishers actually getting along right now? Well, many are still working on full frontlist coverage, even though regulations are already in full force. So some of them are still putting out brand new publications that aren't compliant. Until they start losing in their procurement efforts and sales teams start feeding back, it won't really put a fire under them until that happens. Many publishers are now outsourcing to try and deal with some of the tasks of creating accessible publications, and they are trying to use AI wherever they can, inevitably. The backlist remains largely untouched. There are some publishers who are looking into this. Most publishers are trying to just hope that problem goes away. If they have perennial sellers in their catalogs, then they will deal with them because they know that's a bigger legal risk, but that's about it. Language tagging. So if there are words in languages other than the base language, so if we have an English book with some French words, we need to mark those so that the word is read in the correct voice. And that's very difficult in English because we're full of borrow words. I've put some in the presentation, which you'll be able to get later. Those particularly could make this problematic, especially in language learning where we need to pronounce things properly. How a publisher's doing depends on workflows. Most have done absolutely nothing on it. Some have tried to make editorial process changes to help. And a lot of publishers just saying we can't do it and we'll need to make an exemption claim. Interactivity is a huge topic, especially in education, but it covers all sorts of different things where somebody might need to interact with a page. The accessibility requirements are far broader for this than they are just for passive content, just for consumptive content. It's really hard to make this work with screen readers, especially with the standard formats that are designed primarily for passive consumption. There are custom platforms out there, but they require a lot of reworking of publications. And of course, VLEs, which are often the answer, can be made very accessible, but require very different workflows to traditional publishing models. And that's a big step change for a lot of publishers. So how are publishers getting along at the moment? Many are sticking to fixed formats like PDF and fixed layout EPUB and really not dealing with this issue at all. They're just using those to keep the layouts as they are in print. Of course, some using tools like Articulate Storyline to make SCORM and XAPI packages for LMS systems. But again, this is a very different model to standard publishing, and it's a huge step change for the publishers to kind of get themselves around. Some are moving to custom e-learning platforms and then adapting their publications to fit. One that I worked on was with Macmillan Education, who came up with a whole new custom solution to give an accessible print page reproduction and a flowing version, which you can switch between at any point, that works with a screen reader and all the activities work. This is the kind of gold standard of what can be done, but of course, it's very expensive and difficult to do. Backlist requirements. This is a big, hard problem for publishers. There's a variation in national requirements. So you can't just say it's the EAA or the ADA. You need to be very specific about where you're talking about. Deep backlist file formats can be very diffuse. Different points in time, publications were made differently. The condition, the quality can be very variable. Author and editor availability can be a problem when you need to backtrack and fix something old. Demand is pretty difficult to measure. And if you have a request system for deep backlist, then lots of stakeholders in a publishing company have to participate, and that takes time to organize. So I would describe publishers' progress on this as pretty glacial. They're very confused over requirements still, which keeps me employed. It's early days, so frontlist is the focus, especially in education, where obviously there's less of a catalog backlist. There's less of a catalog long tail to drag along. There's lots of effort going into request systems as a kind of legal backstop. Color contrast, I'll skip through this one relatively quickly, but text on a color background, anyone who's used to working with accessibility is very familiar with this and the WCAG requirement. Publishers are finding it quite difficult. They're used to designing with pure aesthetics in mind and having to just get this into their minds, really for print design as well as for digital, to avoid having to make two separate products. And they don't always realize there are free tools there to help them. It's especially tricky for the backlist because of the amount of it. Some designers are also pretty resistant to it, although I've met plenty who have been doing this for years. You can make plenty of nice designs without violating the WCAG color contrast guidelines. It's very dependent on publishers instilling this into their design and production practices and pre-flights. But educators can help by just feeding back about this when it becomes a problem. And again, I'm seeing from the jobs that people are showing in the chat, you are all the type of people who I want to be pushing back at publishers about the accessibility problems in their books. They need to know this. They need to realize that there is demand. Finally, our hard problem of metadata. So while the European Accessibility Act specifies metadata, the ADA doesn't. But all of these institutions that need accessible content to not fall foul of the ADA will only know this because of metadata. So in the end, it still needs to be there. Otherwise, they won't know that these titles meet their needs. I know there are other ways of signaling that, but they will expect this in metadata. Of course, this metadata standard depends on workflow and production type, so I won't go into detail on that right now. But publishers are finding it difficult to do this. Someone who writes accessibility metadata needs to understand the content, but also the production processes and accessibility rules. There aren't many people that understand all of that and can write the accessibility metadata, so it tends to get passed around different people, which makes it slow. It's highly dependent on the type of publishing and the metadata standard for that sector. So solution needs to be specific to your content and your main distribution platforms, is what I tell every publisher. But many are using different forms of templating. So you'll find more of them will start to have metadata, but it may be less accurate because the publishers are just trying to use templating and do it in bulk and get as accurate as they can. It's not ideal, but this is what's happening. So in summary, global legislation is largely driving in the same direction. It's all looking at WCAG 2.2 or 2.1 AA. US legislation changes are having a major impact on procurement requirements this April for larger publishers and next April for the smaller ones. Some publishers may be sleepwalking into sales problems and lawsuits. Demand and feedback from teachers and learners will help drive change. And learner support is becoming more challenging, as I'm sure plenty here know, because of the differences in format, legal entitlement in different places, and technical complexity. But it has never been for learners, and to really nail it into publishers that this is not just an imaginary risk. We need you to do this, or we ain't buying. And that will come to the end of this. I just about, I think, made it on time. I heard a lot of clanging, but I think we're good.
I'm so sorry about that. Yes, my saucepan lid with which I was doing the little bell noises, I accidentally dropped on the floor. So thank you to those who've been sending me messages checking I'm okay, but I am. Simon, thank you so much for that. What would be great, I know there's various comments and questions in the chat. What would be great is if you could, perhaps in the chat or maybe just briefly now, give us an example of some of the publishers that you think are doing really well, because that's always helpful.
Yeah. So I suppose I'll go back to the Macmillan example I gave earlier, right? So I worked with them over a year. It was well over a year on really how they're going to deal with all these textbooks that needed to continue. They contain lots of activities and interactives. That's as hard as it gets. Complex design and interactive, and they will lose their market completely if they didn't become accessible in a lot of markets. Right, would just stop buying them. So that was a huge challenge. Of course, they had the resources to go at it with Springer Nature money, so they did an amazing job. And I worked with them over all that time, trying to figure out what would be compliant. Quickly figuring out that EPUB wasn't going to work. But that PDF was not sufficient. And so a custom platform really made an amazing learner experience. That is what I wish all publishers could do, but they can't because it's very expensive, and that's fair enough. So there's a huge variation out there, but worrying about losing their market is the big motivator for a lot of them.
Right. So that's definitely a responsibility for our active and often very proactive library community to keep pressing the publishers, say, what are you doing? Are you compliant? And even making sure that their accessibility statements are up to date, honest, and accurate. And there I would give it a plug for looking for the Aspire scores for publishers as well, from Textbox Digital. So, Simon, thank you very much. There are comments there. And I think, Lillian, do you want to introduce Rebecca? Or
Yeah, I'm conscious Simon has to go. I wonder if he can take just one question,
Oh,
Simon.
I've got some. Yeah, I
Is
don't have
that
to go
all
yet.
right? It's a slightly technical question from Vincenzo, but it's about EPUB, and I wonder if you know. But Vincenzo, please feel free to come on and ask your question directly, Vincenzo.
Oh, hi. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was not expecting to be asked to speak. No, I mean, in maths, we definitely have a consistent problem of you can produce EPUBs of reasonable quality, but then almost nobody can read them because the software is lacking. Is there any
Yes.
pressure from the legislation on that front, also on what happens on the software side to access the actual things that's been published?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely there is. But actually, the producers of reading systems are pretty on top of this. They're very involved in the conversations that I have with the W3. The problem is really that the end platforms that tend to kind of white label that software to use it don't update it. They build their distribution models around ancient versions, and it doesn't get updated. So it's really not a problem in software. There's plenty of really capable e-reading software, including for EPUB, and a lot of it's free. You can license Readium. But unfortunately, again, a lot of these platforms built using ancient versions of Adobe or anything else, and it becomes a real problem. Somebody also mentioning DRM. So yes, this can all come up, but again, there are open source ways of dealing with that now. There's no excuse of kind of from the e-reader side. We've got plenty of great software out there. It's just the companies that use them as their reader for their platform tend to lag.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you have time, Simon, to
not
answer something in the chat, that will be really good. But yeah, I like to kind of pass the presentation baton over to Bec, who will introduce herself. But thank you very much, Simon.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. That was so interesting. Thanks, Simon. I'm going to share my slides. Let's just see. Beginning. Hopefully everybody can see these now. Just let me know if you can. So my name is Rebecca Oliva. I'm the Alternative Formats Manager at Glasgow University. I trained to be a librarian 10 years ago, and then I was a learning technologist for a while. Been working in accessibility for about 5 or 6 years. And now I manage the Alternative Format Service, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. As well as managing that service where we sort of procure the accessible versions of text for students that need them. I also advise on the accessibility of learning and teaching resources, and I work on procurement for our ebooks and vendors and things as well. I've been doing that recently too. But what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about the overview of the service, and it follows on from what Simon was saying really well, because I'm going to talk about what we actually do when we need to make accessible versions of textbooks and library resources for students who need them. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we have as well. So our service, it's a brand new service. It's only existed for about a year and a half, and not every university has one. What we do is we aim to provide eligible staff and students, so it's just like any other library staff and students service, staff and students can use it. And we aim to supply those staff and students with the library resources they need in their preferred format within 2 weeks of request. So it's quite a fast turnaround. Before the service, people were waiting 6 to 8 weeks for resources that didn't always suit them. We work actually mostly on reading list texts rather than requests, and we aim to supply these a week in advance. So if a text is on the syllabus for week 6, we'll supply it by week 5. And we do the same thing with slides where we can, or course notes and stuff as well. We'll try and get that a week in advance. So who's eligible for this service? So anybody with a print disability is eligible, and a print disability is any cognitive, visual or physical disability that makes interacting with printed materials difficult. So it could be a student who's got a reading or learning disability like dyslexia, it could be a visual disability, and most of the time I'm working with students who have visual impairment, blindness or low vision, or any other physical mobility or flexibility disability that makes using a library resource difficult. And something that's important to say, because I saw someone was talking in the chat about working with students who they think might have dyslexia, is that I don't ask for proof at any point. If somebody thinks that they have one of these things, well, if they think they're dyslexic, then we can help them, that's fine. The reason that definition of print disability is so well defined is because it has a legal basis. It's in a copyright exception, which comes from the Marrakesh Treaty, and that means that we can copy texts on behalf of print disabled students and staff. Without we're not limited. We can copy the whole text, and we can make intermediary copies in between different formats and different versions. All we have to do is keep a record of what we make, and then we have to notify publishers that we have done it. This also includes where we've got a print copy of something, we can go to the publisher and ask for a digital copy so that we can make an accessible version, for example, for someone who uses a Braille device. And lots of publishers are ready and expecting those requests. Some smaller publishers maybe aren't, but lots of publishers are ready for those requests, and they can send you something quite quickly. Other publishers use Bookshare, which I'm sure lots of people have heard of. You can use RNIB Bookshare. It's a database where publishers put all their titles on it, and students or our service can go on and access them. So I wanted to talk a bit today about how we actually create alternative formats. I think it's pretty interesting. So we usually are getting asked to supply digital documents to students and staff. There are some cases where it wouldn't be digital. For example, if we wanted to make tactile graphs or maps, maybe we wouldn't use a digital version. We'd make a copy of something. But usually we're making digital documents because the students and staff we support are using assistive technologies to read. That could be a magnifier so they can make things really big. It could be a screen reader like JAWS, and it could be a text-to-speech tool like Text Help. And the format that we'll supply the student with tends to depend on which assistive technologies they use. And it can also depend on what subject they study. So for example, I know one student who relies on magnification. They use a magnifier, and we make Word files that look almost exactly like the PDF files, so that he can edit and change the text if he needs to make something clearer. But because he studies law, the way those texts are laid out is quite key to understanding them sometimes. So the easiest way we've come to make accessible versions for him is to sort of transpose the PDF to Word, but leave the formatting in place. For other students, for example, students who use Braille devices, if they want to read journal articles that are in a PDF format, we might use Abby Fine Reader to make a Word version of that, and we would even put in the page notes in the body, the page numbers in the body of the text, so the student can still cite the exact part of the text that they need. So although you might think that alternative formats and accessible documents are the same thing, they're often not for us, because we're trying to think about the quickest way to get something usable to the student. So we're making documents more accessible, but we're not necessarily creating a 100% accessible document all of the time. When we do make alternative formats, we always make sure that it has machine readable text that makes sense. We make sure that it has pagination that makes sense, because students need to cite things. So if we're making text bigger and clearer, and just having one column left aligned, and we're getting rid of dual columns and diagrams that have been floated to the left or right of text, we often end up with more pages than the original document had. And we'll make sure the pagination runs on the right pages. We've got little macros that help us with that. And we also add in markup a lot of the time. The reason we're doing that is because I'm sure lots of you who work with PDFs that are supplied from publishers or journals know that there might be OCR there, but there isn't tagging. So when we create Word documents, we'll put in all the styles or the markup so that students can use the commands in their assistive tech, like on the screen reader, to navigate through the document. We also sometimes then add image descriptions if somebody needs it. Image descriptions we put in below the text rather than alt text, because someone who uses magnification and has never used a screen reader actually probably doesn't know about alt text or how to access it. So we'll give longer image descriptions in the text. We'll add alt text if somebody needs that for their screen reader. We add in table captions quite often. One thing I find, especially with presentations that have, I've had a politics lecture that had 90 slides in it, and a lot of the slides had tables on those slides. Now, if you think about that, there's no way that everybody in the classroom is being asked to analyse or understand the data in a graph. It's likely that that graph or table is pointing out one really clear trend or one really clear point if you're going through that many slides in an hour. So I often encourage teaching staff, and I will always add a caption that explains the purpose of the graph or the table. And then we quite often add colour contrast adjustments. So we are making sure that the documents that we create meet the sort of WCAG ratios and standards, but we'll also often have specific colour contrast adjustments for specific students as well that we note down. Here's an example of what we do. So on the left, there's a journal article, which can be a bit of a headache if you're magnifying or if you're using a screen reader, and it can be pretty difficult to understand. On the right, you can see what it starts to look like in Word. We preserve all the content. We just make sure that it reads in the right order, and that it's easy to use. And then I've got some markup in there. That title will be a heading one, so that the student can use keyboard commands to access the document, and it makes it all a lot clearer. We tend to take footnotes and stick them at the end of a document. Actually, we turn them into endnotes. It's just easier. In Abbey, sometimes I'll do 2 passes through a document, take all the content out, then I'll take the footnotes out and I'll merge them into one document. Makes it a lot easier. We do have an automated tool called Census Access that students can use. Some of you might have Census Access at your institutions. It's a form that lives on our website. It works by email relay, and it takes inaccessible documents and it can create accessible ones. So it can tag a PDF for you. It can, from your type PDF, I think then you can make a Word document. And from there, you can create MP3s, Daisy books, EPUB, and more. It's really good, but if the original document is lacking in markup, then it can be quite limited in what it does. And that's what we tend to find from publishers, is that while their online readers are quite accessible, the content that we download isn't. They're not giving us completely accessible documents like I'm talking about here on this slide to work with. They're giving us OCR documents, but they're not accessible. So then we can't necessarily use Census Access in the best way for students. They can't easily make EPUBs. They might as well make an MP3 that kind of isn't indexed because it doesn't have that markup. Yeah, this is what I was saying, alternative formats versus accessible documents. I'd like them to be a lot closer, but they're not the same thing at the moment. And even if publishers supplied us with perfectly accessible documents, our team might still need to add specific image descriptions for that discipline or that class. We might need to adjust contrast and colours. And sometimes I even edit diagrams where they've been drawn and all the content is bunched up on one side because of the layout of a page, and I'll space that out and sort of edit the diagram so it's easier for some students to use. Okay, the challenges. DRM, which somebody mentioned in the chat, digital rights management, is the biggest challenge. So some vendors will let students download the whole text so that they can use it with their screen reader or their assistive tech, but then it must be read by Acrobat and rather than their tech, and then the student gets stuck. So they can only download a certain amount under the copyright license where they can use their assistive tech, and the rest of it they have to read using the online reader. So DRM, rights restrictions and copyright restrictions, which we're talking about here, are one of the biggest problems. And they don't just affect the students, they affect us as well. So I can't go online on a publisher or vendor site and tick a box that says, I'm the alternative format service, give me the whole file. That box just doesn't exist. Usually I have to fill in a an inaccessible form, send it off to the publisher, wait a couple of weeks, and it really causes delays to our service. I can use RNIB Bookshare sometimes, but quite often the files that are in Bookshare are not accessible either necessarily. They are also just PDF files. Some suppliers are good at putting up Word files. The other thing that we've started to notice is that download buttons have become trickier to find. They're kind of hidden under print buttons sometimes on the publisher websites or the vendor websites, and then sometimes the download limit is then split between like a download limit and then a limit for copying and pasting, which seems arbitrary to me. And again, you're just limiting how much of the text a student who needs to use assistive tech can read. Publishers have made massive steps forward in terms of building online readers that are more accessible and have lots of little tools. But if you have a more complex disability, you definitely have your own tools on your device that you use, and a copy that you can download and use in the way that you want to use it is the best option always. So because of that, we, in some cases, as a last resort, we might even request a text from our scan and send team if we've got a print copy, and we'll start from scratch and make one ourselves, where we can't get a copy of the whole text. The PDFs, yeah, so PDFs often do not meet accessibility standards. There are some vendors, I don't want to name and shame, but they don't have any OCR text. I think, I've thought about it a lot, because in the online reader you certainly can highlight the text and copy and paste out of it, but when you download it you can, and I think it is a bit of copyright legislation, or it's a copyright tactic there, where they're trying to sort of just screenshot what you were reading rather than give you the actual file that they've uploaded. PDFs often float page numbers. The publisher will put the page numbers in the middle of the page in a margin. It's very difficult for assistive tech to know when to read that or where to put it in. They don't have alt text. They don't have tags that are correct, and the reading order is often incorrect as well. The best description I can give of that is we've got 2 columns on a PDF, and the screen reader will read across both rather than down one and down the next one. EPUB files, they're still quite rare. I don't often find that many EPUB files in everything that I am looking at. I think that's also because lecturers don't update their reading lists so often, so that could also be why. But they're really difficult for us to amend, so part of me is a little bit nervous about this move to EPUB, because I can imagine that some students might want to stick with reading things in Word, for example, rather than an EPUB file. People are really loyal to the students and staff I support are quite loyal to what they know works, as we swap over to EPUB, as we get used to it, I can anticipate that might be quite difficult, but it's also difficult for us to amend those files. So it's something we're looking into learning more about. Page numbers, I kind of already spoke about this. I go on about it all the time. Page numbers make students request PDFs. That's how important students think citations are. I'd love it if we stopped asking students to give page numbers and asked them to give chapter headings. But that's a kind of cultural change. But students will ask me for PDF because of the page number, and when I explain, no, we can put page numbers in the text, and you can use a text that suits you, that's got larger font and is easier to adjust. They're quite excited about it, but page numbers takes us a really long time. It's one of the most time-intensive things that we do. I don't know whether this one will be solved as a kind of a culture change where we don't need to cite page numbers, or whether somebody's going to come up with a clever fix for this. I'm not sure. So math, engineering, physics, this all takes way more effort on our part. That's because equations are really difficult for us. At the moment, the best solution we've got, because we are supporting students who have more occasional equations in the materials that they use, rather than a maths student who is using all PDFs that were created in LaTeX. What we do is we tend to use Wacom tablets and the ink equation editor, so that I can quickly write out the equation, and it creates an accessible version in the Word document. And we've also got licenses for MathPix. Am I out of time here?
1 minute.
1 minute, thanks. So ancient languages are another problem for us. The only text we've ever had a problem creating an accessible copy of, where we had to give up, it's happened once, was Plato, and it was because the Greek, the publisher just didn't have a file with machine readable text for us, and it was actually kind of amazing to realise that's how old the text was. They don't have an accessible version of it. There was no way for us to solve that problem. In this case, the problem could be solved in future by using an updated version of that an edition that was published more recently, but the entire class was using that version, so it would have been much easier, again, for the page numbers. You know, we're on page 16, everybody flips to the same page, if we had been able to create an accessible version of that, but we actually weren't able to do it. It's the only time that's happened. I'm going to skip over the overview. We're doing lots of items, 600 a semester, I would say. Most people want Word documents, and the feedback on our service is really positive, because students have gone from waiting 6 to 8 weeks to, you know, getting things a week in advance. And I think this feedback on the screen here, where they're saying this is life-changing, I'm catching up with books that have been in my to-be-read pile of years, I couldn't read them, I have no words explaining how much this has changed my research and scholarship. You know, we were so happy and delighted to read that. It makes every minute you spend sort of fiddling around with things in Abbey totally worth it when you get replies like this. And this one is just, I wanted to share this because it's bigging up the team and just saying that everybody's really thoughtful. One thing I can say about it, because we've got the staffing to do it, we spend a lot of time thinking about exactly how something will work for that student, rather than a sort of generic fix. So we're quite proud of that. We don't support a huge number of students though, so we're able to do that. Okay, I'll pause there and take questions. Sorry, I've sort of rushed through that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bec. And I know you posted a question for us to kind of ask other people about how do you create alternative formats at your institution? This is a question from Bec to the audience. We've had huge numbers of questions, and I'm afraid Simon isn't here anymore, so I will be sending him some questions, and we'll see if we can kind of add it to our webpage post this session. But you've had a lot of questions, so I'll try and do a quick summary, and maybe some people could come on the mic and ask questions, but we only have about 15 minutes, so we have to try and keep a tight handle on that. Sorry. So, but Lola was asking, a 2-week turnaround is quite prompt. Which then asks the question, you know, how many people are there in your alternative format service team?
There's 3 of us. So there are 2 alternative formats officers, and then there's me. I don't do as much of the actual reformatting, but there are at least sort of 2 full-time staff doing reformatting all the time. So we do sort of have, yeah, we've got the staff where we can make that deadline work. It's not going to work if you don't have the staff to do it. Yeah.
And then the matching question, I guess, is how many students? I know I asked you there, how many students do you service? Yeah.
So we have a pool of, like, I would say about 20 people that could send us a request at any time, and we've got noted down what they need. But actually this semester we're probably supporting 9 students more holistically with everything that they need. And those students who we support holistically with everything, and everything that they read comes through us, those students all have visual impairments. So that's sort of how that works. Yeah.
Yeah, and then lots of people are kind of agreeing with you about how page numbering is like and footnotes are taking up a huge amount of time. I love it that this webinar has made that visible to the community, the amount of work that takes. And also Lindsay was reinforcing this idea that, you know, the layout of legal text can be very important to meaning, not just legal text, but some other texts.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, and Ross was reinforcing your point about the fact that something can be digitally or technically accessible, but actually hard to use for certain students.
So I have loads to say on that because we've been looking at our procurement processes and doing a bit of auditing of all the publishers. And something that I've noticed is WCAG is great for testing their web pages, and then we can test their online readers with it. And then we have to swap to a different standard to look at the PDF files that come out. And then the user experience of all this kind of gets left to the side. But one of the things we were thinking about is in WCAG, we would consider it a failure if the layout and the menu doesn't stay the same. But then when we think about students and staff who have to use all the different vendors in the library catalogue, and they might be doing that on really high magnification where those vendor sites don't work very well, we're kind of failing them. And we're doing that by saying, like, we've kind of sort of got contracts with all these vendors, and it's just part of it that you'll have to learn to use all these websites that are slightly different and don't look exactly the same. And it's difficult for you to know that, for example, until you start using all of them. So we've started to use like heuristic testing as well as just accessibility testing to try and think about how we can evaluate publisher sites. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. So there was a bit of a discussion about services like Bookshare in other countries, and then people asking about, well, kind of mentioning the lead time in terms of getting materials from lecturers so that you know what that pool of resources that you have to convert. But there was a question more recently about, do you have a set of questions that you ask students in terms of their preferences for what they need? And is this information provided in a discussion?
I always have a discussion with students about what they need. I do have a checklist that I run through, and maybe I can share it with the group afterwards.
Yeah.
Probably need to tidy it up a bit. It's it's a very well used Excel file. But I always have a discussion because students will. Any tech user will say they want one thing, and there's every possibility that another thing could work better. That could be because they're used to doing something a certain way, and that is how we realised that people were requesting PDF, and then they were making a Word file that wasn't very good out of it, and then going back to the PDF to cite. And that's when we realised, no, we can just send you the Word file. So I have quite a long discussion, and I try and meet students in person when I set up how their files are going to look. And I'll meet with students as well to see how they're getting on using the files, usually a couple of times in the first semester. So it's not just a checklist, but I could share that if you want. And I think it's always worth watching someone use the file that you've sent them. And sometimes I work with students who are also, there's a delay in terms of them getting the tech they need. There are delays with DSA funding and stuff. So sometimes I'll meet someone once, show them how to use Immersive Reader, put stuff on their Word drive, get something that kind of works, and then I'll meet them again once they've got the actual tools that they need. So yeah.
It certainly sounds like you're blending your job not just as alt format, doing that service of doing the work, but actually meeting the student like an assistive tech officer would do as well.
Yeah, and we know the assistive tech trainers at Glasgow Uni as well quite well. So then I can say, how would you do this? Or, ask them for help, or could you give some extra training? Or so we do that. But yeah, I think I used to just work in accessibility where everything was about compliance and technical tests. So I had to pick up all the user stuff in this role.
Yeah, there's lots of people very interested in your checklist. So
okay.
If you can tidy it up, and whether you're posting it on your own blog site or LinkedIn site, and we can link to it for our readers, or if you want us to host that on our future teacher page along with your talk, we'd be happy to do that as well.
Great, yeah.
Brilliant. So Justin was asking, do you work through each reading list of those students that you support, or do you create text on a request by request basis?
We do both. Students can send us requests, and then we work through everything essential on the reading list. And sometimes I have to go to staff and say, no, you cannot have 300 essential readings on a reading list. You have to tell me what's actually essential and what the student is actually expected to read. And staff will tell me, no, I can't, or we collaborate on the reading list, and I have to just be so stern and say, this just doesn't work. We're totally failing under the Equality Act. We've got moral duty to sort this out so the student can join in. So, Yeah, I pester teaching staff quite a lot, and that's a huge. I probably do that for 6 weeks before the start of any semester.
Mm.
Um,
There's a lot of labor on that front. You're getting a lot of, I don't think this is recorded on the webinar, but Bec is getting a lot of responses on the Zoom chat from people who was like, yes, I hear you, I see you, and this is what's happening to us as well. So it's getting a huge response. So, it's a plea to academics that this isn't about us trying to make your life difficult. This is about us trying to do the right thing for students, and we all need to be part of that process. Absolutely brilliant. I think we do have, we've had quite a bit of discussion about Bookshare and possibilities in other countries as well. And then Sophie had a very interesting question. Are there any institutions working towards remediating all digitizations for reading lists?
can I answer? Is that for everybody, or can I
For
answer that one?
everybody, regardless of known disabilities. So people with hidden disabilities, people who haven't declared, and not forgetting our international students who don't
Absolutely.
qualify. Yeah.
What we're doing now is we're tagging PDFs. We're trying to tag them automatically using census access. So our reading list scanning team do that. And then at the institution where I previously worked, we did have a workflow for everything that we scanned. Sometimes this is just a bigger question, but sometimes I wonder why we can't have a sort of, instead of scans, why there isn't a standard of just moving stuff into an HTML format, why we've stuck to PDFs for so long.
Yeah.
It feels so much more worth it if we could have some kind of centralized repository of HTML content that could be easily repurposed. But
And on that point, I think a couple of people have kind of mentioned, if only once we've done this hard work of making the Word version, we could share it with each other in HE. It's like RNIB Bookshare.
Yeah.
Is there a process for kind of pushing that back into RNIB Bookshare, or is that a gap?
There is. We don't use it. We're working on our own repository, which we are going to go that way. So some people do put scans on Bookshare, but what we're thinking is that we'll probably use a repository that we use for open access educational resources already, and that's because then we can put lecturers' slides and things like that up there as well. We're entitled as well legally to all share that content the same way that Bookshare do. That's okay for one university to lend to another. But I think once we've got our own repository, we'll be sharing that definitely with the alt formats community.
Oh, we're all going to be watching this space, Rebecca. Absolutely. And lots of people have said, yes, they do push texts back into Bookshare. But as you stated as well, sometimes you may have formatted things for one particular student's needs, so adaptations might still have to be made for other specific students. But just having it in, say, a Word document in the first place is helpful, and not having to redigitize things. But I mean, this is a question for me. In that case, why does it still feel like such a gap? I guess it's because there are so many books and so many students doing so many courses that it literally is like a lottery to go on Bookshare and find that someone else has digitized a book for, a particular course.
I feel like a complete lottery. And then some publishers are better at it than others. Some disciplines are better than others. I don't know what makes some publishers inclined to do it, and others not. I'm not sure about it. It depends on what type of material that you're studying as well. So courses like sociology, business courses, all the material is always there. And then you look at other texts, other disciplines, and the material's just not there. And those publishers for some reason haven't done it. So I'm really puzzled by that. And I don't know what makes some publishers work on that. And I think the other thing that might affect this is that some subjects are easier, I guess, to study. It's easier to access materials, so then that might change what subjects students are studying. I've often thought about that. If it's very hard to access accessible copies of certain books, are we sort of shutting out a lot of students from certain courses. Yeah, I think so.
And Mike was asking you a question. Do you also create captions for audio or audio described video?
We would do that if we needed to, yeah. We haven't had to do that yet. We have supplied the transcripts of a TV program where we couldn't find the TV program. It was just listed in a suggested sort of bibliography for students. So we got the transcript, but we couldn't find the TV program. But yeah, we would do that. We just haven't done it yet. And that's one of those things that we'll just work out how to do as we go. Yeah.
Excellent.
So just find out. Yeah.
That's great. I think Elizabeth mentioned that Bookshare require PDF and EPUB versions. So are Bookshare no good for hosting the Word versions of things? Does anyone know? If the Word version of something can be put back into Bookshare?
You can, yeah.
You can.
We download Word quite often, so it must be.
Yeah, it is possible then. Okay, that's great. That's good to know. And Mike was asking about maybe should students be taught to, last question, what do you think about students being taught to use AI to help with accessing or, maybe doing summaries, etc., as an assistive tool with their reading?
It's good. Again, it depends on the different disabilities that students have. So some students, if you're using magnification or JAWS or a screen reader, they're legally entitled just to receive the format that works for them. And we definitely don't want to increase the workload for those students when there's already an additional burden to using that tech at university where all the systems maybe are not set up for you, and they should be. Whereas on the other hand, we have lots of students maybe who are dyslexic, and I'll help them to use self-service tools like Census Access or other AI tools, and to interrogate the text, work with the text to make reading more enjoyable. So it just depends whether that suits the student. But the idea of alternative formats, I guess, wouldn't be that you need to make it yourself. It's that the university supplies it.
Brilliant. But thank you so much, Bec. We've raced through the majority of the questions. I think you'll enjoy reading back through the chat. If you want to kind of save that for yourself, you can do. You're getting loads of applauses on screen. It's been absolutely wonderful presentation from yourself, and thanks for answering all those questions. We just have a few minutes to go, and we do tend to stay on after we stop the recording as well. So if you can hang on and people can ask you questions directly, that would be fabulous. But we also would like to remind everyone that we have our next webinar. Ron, do you happen to have the link ready for people who might want to sign up to our next webinar, which is on use of AI in teaching, learning and support, I think. Yeah. So that might be of interest to this audience as well. And the following month in April, we've got a session on teaching neurodivergent students. And then in May, our sessions on teaching digital accessibility to others. So lovely titles coming up. But yes, Ron's added the reg form for the next session into the chat. And a reminder that obviously if you keep up on our website, we will soon be uploading this recording and the corrected captions on there. And as soon as Bec shares any resources, we can certainly add it to that area as well. So yes, so we've got a couple of minutes to go, but I'm going to suggest we stop the recording here and carry on the conversation after.